For the first half of 2023, we were talking about the imminent and pending Ukrainian counteroffensive against the Russian occupation of their country. Billions of dollars of Western military aid has been pouring into Ukraine. Western tanks that were promised to be game changers, Western anti-missile systems that were promised to be game changers, and then Western planes, which will be duly serviced and will of course be game changers. And now we're here, 2 months into the counteroffensive reality. And the simple fact, however much we may hate to say it, is that we have seen limited gains. The segments marked in purple on this map, sourced from the Institute for the Study of War, are the areas where Ukraine has advanced since May. Russia occupied 1/5 of Ukraine before, and Russia occupies 1/5 of Ukraine now. Not much has changed. This obviously wasn't what people had been hoping for. Back in November last year, Ukraine offered the giddy prospect of significant turnarounds when it retook the city of Kherson, with Russian forces then apparently in retreat. In the time between then and now, Russia has spent a lot of time digging in, fortifying and defending their positions. This satellite picture from Planet Labs, with labels added by the BBC, shows the sort of defence that they've deployed. The Ukrainians firstly have to get past the anti-tank ditch, then a layer of so-called dragon's teeth, concrete obstructions to prevent tanks from being able to progress, then a trench network, trenches that, once they are abandoned by Russian soldiers, are often extensively booby-trapped with explosives. And behind all of that, the Russian artillery positions, to take out as much as they can of the forces that are being impeded into making only slow progress. The world had gotten used to a Russian military that was astonishing in the ineptness of its leadership and its general incompetence on the battlefield. Those days are long gone, at least in relation to how they pursue their defensive strategies, where they've been described instead as, quote, surprisingly innovative and effective. Now, Ukraine does have the ability to launch missiles and the like deep behind Russian lines, to take out strategic targets such as fuel depots and ammunition stores and the like. And the newly deployed cluster bombs are said to be effective against some of the entrenched Russian positions. So it doesn't mean that progress isn't possible, but nevertheless, behind the scenes, political and military leaders on all sides will be re-evaluating the dynamics of the conflict based on the dawning reality that this could become a much longer, drawn-out affair than they had counted on. More like the 2 world wars that spent long periods of time as brutal and bloody wars of attrition along the length of barely moving front lines. Gradually, the resources of one side were eroded more than the other, a few strategic moves were successfully made, and material superiority was sufficiently built for a breakthrough. But it took years. If that's the nature of the struggle here, there are ways that will impact on Russia and how the war might end, and there are ways in which that will impact on Ukraine and the West. In terms of the impact on Russia, we never know, of course, just how close they might actually be to a military collapse. There has been quite a lot of attrition suffered by their military, a lot of deaths, a lot of destroyed equipment. Given the absence of truly reliable information on how all of this plays out, there's always the potential, just as we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union, for a sudden and dramatic shift that we just didn't see coming. That said, all of the indications are that Ukraine simply does not have the firepower today, nor is expected to in the near future, to wreak the sort of havoc you would need to make that likely. So, the first way, the way many Westerners have been hoping for, of ending the war, i.e. outright military defeat of the invaders on the battlefield, That seems a more remote likelihood right now. That leaves the second way, which is taking the cost of a war home to Mother Russia, to try to make the most of political instability there, to exacerbate the weakness of Putin's domestic position with the hope that political collapse in Moscow will precipitate the end of the war. Probably no coincidence then that on the day of shooting this video, it's reported there is a major fire raging close to Vladimir Putin's expensive and fortified home. And no coincidence indeed that there are drone attacks on Moscow that have continued to take place. This is the step that Western supporters of Ukraine are most concerned about. They just don't want to end up finding themselves pulled into a direct war with Russia, with all that would imply. But from Ukraine's position, it has every interest, if it can do so without losing Western support, in taking the fight onto Russian territory, to bring it home to the Russian people that this situation has consequences for them, not just for Ukraine. Now, it's a difficult balance because you don't want to hit them in ways that unites the population in support against you, that give the appearance of confirming Putin's suggestion that Ukraine is the real aggressor here. But since Putin's edifice is built on the illusion of control, the lie of political mastery, then showing up weaknesses in the Moscow leadership may certainly serve to undermine his position one way or another with different interest groups. Indeed, it looked briefly as though that was exactly what was about to happen, with the Wagner group marching on Moscow in the way that it did. That kind of ended quickly, and in spite of the ripples of panic and instability created by the event, the centre has so far seemed to hold, for now at least. In the meantime, if he can fend off domestic challenges, Putin remains the chief beneficiary of a shift to a long game, particularly if he can find ways to increase the pressure. One example of that in action is Russia pulling out of the agreement on grain shipments and its subsequent targeting of Ukraine's grain production and export infrastructure. Now, on the Ukraine side, things are equally tricky. At some point, lack of progress on the battlefield and the normalisation of the status quo starts to pick away of the unified spirit that has been one of the chief beneficial features of this country under attack. The West largely misses it or ignores it, but domestic political criticism is starting to pick up of the government and President Zelensky, although it's still well below the levels it had reached before the war started. The centralisation of power that makes quick decisions possible during a war, which Zelensky has implemented, well, eventually, as time passes, it becomes a routine habit and begins to look like anti-democratic tendencies. Zelensky is, at heart, a populist politician. Now, that may not be populism as typified by the Trump brand, but nevertheless, he has some of the flaws of that style of governing, and that will start to become more of a factor in a long war, just as it would in peacetime. Right now, when there's a setback or lack of hoped-for progress, Ukrainians blame the Russians and blame Putin. At some point, they will start in some numbers, even if not anything close to a majority, to blame their own government's mistakes and failings. And particularly because pre-war Ukraine was, remember, one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. Personal connections were often more important than merit, and although Zelensky was working to tackle corruption, before the war he was considered to be doing so too slowly and without sufficient urgency. He has often recently been compared to Churchill as a wartime leader. Worth remembering that in the immediate aftermath of winning the war with Hitler, Churchill was then rejected by the electors as being the leader that they wanted for peacetime. In some ways, that may well be the outcome to be hoped for, regardless of the hero worship of Zelensky in the West, because by the time of the war's end, The habits of centralised power might be exactly the ones the country needs to lose in order to rebuild the peace. Maybe he'll be able to do that. More likely, it'll take somebody else. In this more modern, more cynical age, will it take to the end of the war? Putin will be working in whatever way possible to ensure that it doesn't. Right now, there are no alternative political figures with his stature. It seems unlikely any could emerge until after the war's end. Separate to that question, here's another one. Supposing Moscow does not oblige by politically imploding, and suppose the stalemate on the battlefield endures on. At what point does Ukraine begin to adapt its war aims? Right now, the country is united behind the natural and most desirable objective of kicking out the invaders from every square inch of Ukrainian territory. Every logical argument demands it. Anything short of it will be seen to reward the aggressor and potentially seed the next round of aggression in the future once Moscow has rebuilt its strength. But if it becomes popularly believed to be an impossible goal, eventually more voices begin to get raised, expressing willingness to bear that higher cost in order to get peace now. What if acceptance of the territorial status quo could be traded off against the freedom for remaining Ukraine to join NATO, thereby gaining a much stronger security guarantee for the territory that it now has? Now, Putin doesn't like that, but at least such a deal enables him to point at the territory he gained and to claim that was all he ever wanted anyway. Zelensky today wouldn't buy it either, but if the longer scenario has him staring in the face of a potential crumbling of the support of his Western allies, he may realise that the alternatives are bleak and he has few other options. Right now, most Ukrainians would push aside such a possibility. Heck, if I were Ukrainian, I would push aside the possibility. And I'm quite stubborn, so I tend to think that I would still think like that in a year's time. But between now and then, of course, many more people will die, much more suffering will be endured, sadly. If all hope of progress seems to have evaporated, it would only be human nature for people to be re-evaluating how they best play the hand that they have in the face of a hostile world. Bear in mind, we also have China, keen to be seen as brokering the peace. China, which could be the single actor that would be capable of bringing Putin to accept something different to his original goal. Now, maybe in just a few short weeks or months, all of this will have been shown to be idle speculation because, as I said before, there is always the chance of a dramatic breakthrough. It could be that the Russian military has become hollowed out and simply collapses for lack of a centre to hold it together. It could be that Putin fails and we're into the world of dealing with a suddenly emerged successor. You often don't see that coming until literally the moment it's upon you. So holding nerve and fighting on is certainly what everyone will aim to do. It's just worth us noting that in a longer, painful war of attrition scenario, the ground rules will at some point have to shift. There are many ways it can happen, but it will be more likely for it to be to the good if there's some realism applied to the various scenarios in advance, so they are handled skillfully and to best advantage when they emerge. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.